Depo-Provera has been on the market for decades as a convenient birth control shot, one injection every 3 months instead of taking a pill every day.
But in 2024 and 2025, new studies found that women who used Depo-Provera for more than a year faced a significantly higher risk of developing meningioma, a tumor that can grow in the lining of the brain. These tumors can cause serious neurological problems and sometimes require surgery.
Which brings us to our last episode of Big Pharma Behind the Scenes. We'll explore fixing the system. Can drug safety be rebuilt? I'm Terry Turner for Drugwatch.
And I'm Whitney Ray Di Bona, attorney and consumer safety advocate with Drugwatch. In this episode, we'll hear from our experts on what they see as the future of drug regulation and safety.
32 years after the FDA approved Depo-Provera as safe and effective, a large French study published in the BMJ reported that long-term Depo-Provera users had roughly a 5-fold increase in meningioma risk. A later U.S. study found that women using Depo-Provera were 2.41 times more likely than non-users to develop one, and the risk climbed the longer women took the shot.
Those tumors can cause vision and hearing changes, seizures, weakness in the arms or legs, and headaches. And for many women, the first time they heard about this risk was not from their doctor or from the label, but from news stories and lawsuit ads.
Regulators eventually acted. European and Canadian authorities moved first, issuing warnings in 2024. The U.S. Food and Drug Administration finally added a meningioma warning to Depo-Provera's label in late 2025. By then, hundreds of cases had already been filed claiming that the manufacturer failed to warn women about the risk.
Depo-Provera is a perfect example of the pattern we've seen across this series. A drug gets on the market and serious risks emerge only after years of real-world use and new studies. Warnings often lag behind the science, and litigation becomes the tool families use when they feel the system has failed them. Over the last 5 episodes, we've heard how drugs and devices can get approved on shaky evidence, how companies spin risks, how marketing and pricing overpower caution, and how lawsuits step in when regulators lag behind.
So the big question for this final episode is simple to ask, yet brutally hard to answer. Can the agencies that are supposed to protect patients actually change? Or are we stuck relying on litigation as a backup system forever?
We started with the agency at the center of all of this, the FDA. We asked reporters Shannon Brownlee and Jeannie Lenzer whether, after 2.5 years of reporting on these issues, they think the FDA can reform itself.
Here's Brownlee.
Here's the fundamental problem: campaign finance. It all starts there. And because the FDA's boss is Congress, and Congress is in the thrall of its biggest donors, and the pharmaceutical industry is by far its single biggest donor. So Congress is not going to make changes in the laws that govern how the FDA operates until we have campaign finance reform, I don't believe. Yeah. So if you can't get Congress to change the way the laws work, can the FDA actually reform itself? I just don't see it being possible. I don't think that a new commissioner, a really reform-minded commissioner, can come in and actually clean the place up. I don't think that getting rid of all of the division heads and getting a new commissioner and getting new division heads is going to do it.
Brownlee and Lenzer argue that reform doesn't start with the FDA at all. It starts with Congress and campaign money. Congress controls the agency's budget and marching orders, and because pharmaceutical companies are among the biggest political donors, the rules the FDA operates under are influenced by the industry. Here's Lenzer.
How can you have a regulatory agency that is run by the very entity it's supposed to be regulating? And yet that's what exists right now. So yeah, I mean, getting pharma money out, but it is impossible. We've seen over and over, and this is why Shannon was talking about Congress, is that when Congress is activated, they are always activated by pharma, not by lay people. And whenever Congress is activated, we have individual Congress people who intervene on behalf of a company that is headquartered in their state.
According to Open Secrets, a nonpartisan, independent nonprofit organization that tracks campaign contributions and lobbyist spending, the top 20 political contributors among pharmaceutical companies donated nearly $12.5 million to candidates during the 2024 election cycle.
And the pharmaceutical industry spent more than $187 million on lobbying that year. Open Secrets reports that as of 2025, there were 3.5 big pharma lobbyists for every member of Congress. That's 1,893 lobbyists, and just over half of them were former government employees.
Lenzer gives a vivid example from their reporting. When you look at meetings in Washington, industry lobbyists and company representatives get in the door hundreds of times. Independent doctors and consumer advocates might get a handful of meetings by comparison.
There was even an experiment where a researcher called every U.S. senator's office twice, once posing as a regular citizen and once as a registered federal lobbyist. Each time he requested a meeting about a health care bill. The lobbyist got 27 meetings, the citizen got just 7.
Then there's the Prescription Drug User Fee Act, PDUFA, the law that lets drug companies pay fees to help fund FDA reviews. Every 5 years, it's renewed, and Lenzer says each renewal has chipped away at scientific standards, making it easier to approve drugs based on less evidence.
Here's Brownlee.
We need pharmaceutical companies to manufacture drugs. We need the research that's done. We could fund it in a different way. Certainly, rather than privately funding that research, we could do it publicly. But we need these companies to basically make drugs that are going to help people. And there are lots of drugs out there that do help people. But at the same time, you need something that you need an agency that basically ensures that they are playing by the rules. And this is really what we're objecting to, is that nobody's playing by the rules anymore. And the rules exist for a reason. Those scientific standards exist for a reason, because it's very, very easy to fool yourself that patients are getting better. It's very, very easy to not notice how many patients are being harmed if you have billions and billions of dollars at stake. So we need an independent entity that's basically looking out for whether or not the drugs really work and that the drugs are really safe.
Now, Brownlee is clear that we still need drug companies. We need someone to manufacture medicines and run real research. But she argues that when the same entities that profit from new drugs effectively fund and dominate the approval process, you lose the independent referee that the system was supposed to have. Here's Lenzer.
Yeah, so when my friends ask me about the work that Shannon and I have done on FDA, and I just say to them, think of it this way. If you want to know what's the best car on the road, do you want to go to Jeep for the answer to that? No, you want an independent agency. You want somebody who isn't invested in it. But that's what we're stuck with. And it isn't just Jeep. It's Pfizer and Merck and GSK and Lilly and everybody.
Lenzer then boils it down. If you want to know the safest, best car, don't ask the car company. You ask an independent tester. In their view, the current FDA looks too much like asking the manufacturer for the verdict on its own product.
So if the structure is tilted, what would it take to shift it? To answer that, we turned back to whistleblower advocate Lewis Clark, who spent decades trying to get inside information out into the open.
I think that there should be much more transparency in the regulatory process about how they deal with the concerns that are raised. There's a need for the public to get a warning, to get warnings about what's going on, that the greater transparency would be good. In terms of policy at the Food and Drug Administration, there's been a lot of concern about the fact that certainly in terms of the drug approval process of the pharmaceuticals paying the cost of the regulation. And so there's been a lot of concerns raised about whether or not that makes the government almost like the client of the industry instead of the regulators.
Clark says the first fix is simple in principle, hard in practice. It's transparency. When someone raises a serious safety concern inside a company or inside the FDA, there should be a clearer public record of what was raised, how the agency evaluated it, and what it decided to do.
Right now, a lot of that happens behind closed doors. It can take Freedom of Information Act requests, investigative reporting, or litigation discovery just to see how regulators waved a red flag. That delay is part of why people only learn about risks like Depo-Provera's meningioma link years after the fact.
Clark also raises the same concern Brownlee and Linzer do from a different angle, the fact that about 49% of the FDA's budget comes from user fees paid by the companies it regulates.
When drug companies' user fees pay for a big chunk of the review process, it's easy for people inside and outside the agency to start imagining industry as the client instead of the subject of oversight. That's a structural problem, not just a personality issue.
But even if we fix funding and transparency, there's still the problem that a lot of serious risks only show up after a drug is on the market, like Depo-Provera and meningioma, or some of the cancers and cardiovascular events we've talked about.
So we asked former Pharma insider William Soliman what he'd change about post-marketing surveillance if he could start over with patient safety truly at the center.
Soliman, the founder and CEO of the Accreditation Council for Medical Affairs, says it's crucial to set clear standards for medical science liaisons, or MSLs. They're the experts who connect drug and device companies with healthcare providers.
I think the biggest thing is making sure that you have people who are looking at the data, looking at these safety signals with experience in that therapeutic area. So I think that's the first big thing, is making sure that you have people that understand therapeutic area. The second big thing is actually the accreditation and getting them certified so that they actually have the knowledge to know how to analyze data. You would be shocked, Terry, if I tell you how many people don't know how to critically interpret data and evidence. It's very dangerous because you could miss important signals. So yeah, it's not, people make a lot of assumptions, but remember, again, if you're an MD, for example, you're trained to diagnose and treat patients. You're not really trained to develop drugs in clinical trials, to design clinical trials, to be an expert in biostatistics, to interpret, forest plot and things like that. That's not things that you're really maybe have a lot of experience in.
That's why he argues for standardized training and accreditation in medical affairs, so people responsible for monitoring safety all meet a baseline of competence in data analysis and trial design instead of learning everything ad hoc on the job.
It should be really under medical. It should be under the guidance of a licensed physician, a medical director who's licensed and again has experience with looking at data and safety data and things like that. But to be an MSL, you could be, a PhD, you've never run a clinical trial, you've never, worked with patients, and bam, now all of a sudden you're out there running a clinical trial or you're supporting pharma companies to do so. But how are you really qualified to do that? I'll give you an example. I have a PhD. I went to Columbia University, good school. I never learned how to run a clinical trial. I never learned about how pharmaceuticals work. I had to learn all that on the job. And so having that knowledge and that skill set gives you a much better ability to be able to contribute, not just more effectively, but ultimately more compliantly, which is in the best interest of the patient.
Soliman uses a striking comparison. To cut hair in the United States, you need a license and an exam. While most medical science liaisons are skilled and educated, these are people who design trials, interpret safety data, and educate doctors about powerful drugs, but they're not required to get a license or an exam.
His solution is to build real standards through independent accreditation and stronger separation between medical affairs and pure marketing, so that the people shaping doctors' understanding of risk are better equipped and more accountable.
To tie all this together on what real reform would look like, we asked Nora Freeman Ingstrom, the Stanford law professor we've heard from throughout this series, how litigation's role fits with stronger regulation, using lessons from tobacco and opioids.
These suits are very risky. They're very expensive. They take unbelievable time, energy, and ingenuity. So you need to have this motivated plaintiff's bar that's really willing to spend the millions of dollars to get to the root of the problem. And then, of course, if they're not successful, they don't succeed. So you need to kind of motivate, kind of what I think of as the private attorneys general to do this work that our public bodies are too cash-strapped and in some cases too conflicted to do.
Her first key reform: protect the private attorneys general, the plaintiff's lawyers willing to risk millions on complex cases that government can't or won't pursue.
And then you need responsible regulators and legislators to come in and act on what's been learned and unearthed. So I think if you see these two forces working together and in tandem, we can see changes, and we've seen this now. The fatality rates for cigarettes are way down from they were at their peak, and the same opioid fatality rates are starting to come down. It can be effective.
Second, regulators who actually use the information lawsuits uncover, creating the hand-in-hand system that dropped tobacco and opioid deaths rather than waiting for the next Depo-Provera to force their hand. So, Whitney, as we close out Big Pharma's playbook, what does a realistic path forward look like based on everything we heard today?
So we have to be really clear that at the end of the day, there isn't a single reform that fixes all of this. Real accountability requires pressure from every direction at once. Regulators need independence, stronger evidence standards, and the courage to act quickly when safety signals emerge. Post-market surveillance can't be an afterthought. It has to be robust, transparent, and insulated from commercial influence. Courts also play a critical role. Litigation tools like MDLs, whistleblower protections, and consumer laws do more than just compensate victims. They actually expose information that the public would otherwise never see or have access to, and they force companies to answer hard questions under oath. And they change the financial calculus behind risky decisions. But none of that works if education and influence remain tilted. Doctors deserve unbiased information, patients deserve transparency, independent experts and advocates deserve a meaningful seat at the table. If we want a system that truly prioritizes safety, we have to align incentives with accountability. Otherwise, we'll keep reacting to the next crisis instead of preventing it. And that's a cycle that we should all be determined to break.
So the system can change, but it's not going to reform itself quietly from the inside. It changes when patients, families, whistleblowers, journalists, regulators, and lawyers all push in the same direction. And that direction is towards safety, transparency, and accountability that doesn't depend on the next scandal.
That's been our goal with this series: to show how the playbook works, where it breaks down, and how ordinary people have used the tools they have to push back.
You've been listening to Big Pharma Behind the Scenes from Drugwatch. If this series has been helpful, follow or subscribe wherever you get your podcasts, and visit drugwatch.com for more information on dangerous drugs, medical devices, and ongoing lawsuits, as well as updates on reforms that could make safety truly non-negotiable.